March 3, 1943. Dawn breaking over Port Moresby, New Guinea. Major Edward Larner's hands were steady on the control column of his B-25 Mitchell bomber as he watched his fuel gauges and listened to the rhythmic thunder of twin Wright Cyclone engines. Through the scratched plexiglass of his cockpit window, he could see 11 more B-25s forming up behind him, their propellers cutting silver circles through the tropical morning air. What the Japanese convoy steaming toward them in the Bismarck Sea did not know was that in the next 15 minutes everything they believed about naval warfare would be shattered by a bombing technique so dangerous, so unorthodox, that conventional military wisdom had labeled it nearly suicidal. The mathematics of destruction were about to be written not in the traditional language of high-altitude precision bombing, but in a new dialect of violence measured in feet above the waves. 200 FT, that was the altitude at which Larner and his squadron would attack, skimming the ocean surface at speeds between 200 and 250 mm, close enough to taste the salt spray, close enough to see the expressions on enemy faces before their bombs skipped across the water like stones thrown by giants. The Japanese had sailed from Rabaul. Believing their convoy was safe under the protection of 8 destroyers and dozens of Zero fighters, they discovered that the rules of naval engagement had changed forever. The transformation had begun 2 months earlier in the headquarters of Lieutenant General George Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, throughout 1942. American bombers had been spectacularly ineffective against Japanese ships, flying at safe altitudes of 5,000 to 100,000 FT. Bombardiers watched helplessly as their weapons fell wide of maneuvering vessels, their bombs creating impressive geysers of water but scoring precious few hits. The statistics were devastating. In one convoy interdiction attempt in January 1943, American aircraft flew 416 sorties and managed to sink only 2 ships while damaging 3 others. The Japanese were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with near impunity, and the tide of the Pacific War hung in the balance. Kenny was a problem solver, a fighter pilot from the First World War who had developed a reputation for unorthodox thinking. He understood that conventional bombing doctrine was failing because ships could maneuver away from bombs dropped from 10. 00 FT gave captains nearly a minute to turn their vessels presenting smaller targets or steering between the falling weapons. The solution required bombers to attack from altitudes so low that ships would have no time to react. But flying within a few hundred ft of heavily armed warships violated every principle of bomber survival. Anti-aircraft guns at that range would have clear fields of fire. A single hit could destroy an aircraft instantly. The risk seemed enormous, yet Kenny had heard of a technique that might change everything. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had successfully employed skip bombing at Rebel on October 22nd to 23rd, 1942, attacking at night and sinking ships by releasing bombs that bounced across the water like flat stones on a pond. The concept was elegantly simple. If a bomber approached a ship at extremely low altitude and released its bombs at high speed with delayed fuses, those bombs would skip across the water surface, bouncing into or under the target vessel before detonating. Ben had proven the tactic worked in combat, but he died on January 18, 1943, when his B-7 disappeared over New Guinea before he could perfect the technique for large-scale daylight operations. No one had yet attempted coordinated attacks by entire squadrons. No one had perfected the modifications needed to make medium bombers survivable at masthead height. No one had trained complete units in the split-second timing required to skip bombs successfully while under intense enemy fire. Until now, the architect of the modified B-25 was Major Paul Gunn, a former naval aviator whose wife and children had been trapped in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded. Gunn's personal rage against the enemy combined with his mechanical genius to produce what became known as the Commerce Destroyer, working in primitive maintenance facilities at Port Moresby. Gunn and his team stripped the bombardier position from the nose of B-25 Mitchell. bombers and replaced it with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. They added more weapons along the fuselage, eventually mounting 8 to 12 heavy machine guns that all fired forward. The result was a flying battleship that could pour devastating firepower into a target while approaching for a bomb run. The guns served multiple purposes. First, they suppressed anti-aircraft fire by sweeping enemy decks clear of gunners. The heavy slugs from 50-caliber weapons could penetrate destroyer hulls, knock out gun positions, and create chaos aboard target vessels. Second, the nose guns allowed the pilot to aim the entire aircraft like a giant weapon. Unlike high-altitude bombing where a bombardier calculated complex trajectories, the low altitude technique required the pilot to fly directly at the target and use a simple reference mark on his windscreen as a gun sight. When the mark aligned with the target ship, the co-pilot or bombardier released the bombs. The approach was brutally direct and demanded nerves of steel, but the modified aircraft were only half the equation. The other half was training pilots to fly them at suicidal altitudes with precision timing. That responsibility fell to Edward Larner, who took command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron. In late December 1942, Larner was a barrel-chested pilot with a reputation for aggressive flying and absolute fearlessness. He wore a beat-up service cap pushed back on his head and was known among his men for being willing to lead any mission he ordered them to fly. When Kenny explained the concept and showed him the modified B-25s, Larner's response was characteristic. He would train his men and they would not miss. Training began in January 1943 on the SS Pruth, a British steamer wrecked on Natiara Reef since December 31, 1923. For weeks, B-25 crews practiced diving to 200 FT and releasing practice bombs toward the rusting hulk in Port Moresby Harbor. Each pilot dropped 30 to 40 bombs, learning to use a windscreen reference mark instead of a bomb site. When one crew struck the wreck's mast and crashed, killing all aboard, the squadron attended the funeral and resumed practicing the next day. Larner drove his men relentlessly because he understood what was at stake. The Japanese were consolidating their hold on New Guinea, building airfields that could threaten Australia itself. American and Australian ground forces were locked in brutal jungle warfare against an enemy that refused to surrender. Every Japanese convoy that reached New Guinea meant more troops, more ammunition, more supplies that would cost Allied lives to overcome. The only way to stop the convoys was to sink them at sea. By late February 1943, the 91st Squadron was ready. Larner reported to Kenny that his boys were a cocky gang who would not miss their targets. Within days, they had their chance to prove it. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on the night of February 28, 1943. Intelligence decrypts from Allied code rears had revealed the convoy's destination and approximate arrival time. New Guinea 8 transport ships carried 6. 900 troops desperately needed to reinforce Japanese positions. Protecting them were 8 destroyers, formidable warships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and veteran crews. The Japanese planners believed the convoy would be safe. They had routed it along the northern coast of New Britain to take advantage of storm fronts that would provide cloud cover. They had assigned experienced captains who understood convoy defense. They had scheduled the journey to minimize exposure to Allied air attacks. Everything had been calculated to ensure success, but the Allies were watching reconnaissance flights track the convoy from the moment it left Rabaul. On the afternoon of March 1st, a B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the ships through A, break in the clouds around 3000. The crew radioed the coordinates and the convoy's course at 5th Air Force Headquarters. The information triggered a carefully prepared plan. Kenny assembled his forces. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses would strike first from medium altitude to scatter the convoy and force the ships into evasive maneuvers. Then the real attack would begin. Modified B-25s from the 91st Bombardment Squadron. A 20 Havocs from the 89th Attack Squadron, Australian bowfighters armed with cannon and machine guns, all attacking at masthead height in coordinated waves that would overwhelm the convoy's defenses. The Japanese faced the full fury of low-altitude warfare for the first time. On this scale, March 2nd began with frustration. Weather obscured the convoy through most of the day. B-7S sent to attack found only clouds and empty ocean. But by evening, the weather began to clear. On the morning of March 3rd, reconnaissance crews relocated the convoy, steaming through the Bismarck Sea toward New Guinea. The ships were about 50 miles southeast of Fincharan, exactly where Allied planners had predicted they would be. Kenny gave the order. All units would attack. The battle was about to begin. Larner gathered his squadron commanders for final instructions. The plan called for different aircraft to attack from different altitudes, simultaneously creating confusion and dividing the convoy's defensive fire. B-7S would bomb from 5,000 to 7,000 FT bowfighters would strafe at wave-top level. The B-25s would come in behind the bowfighters at 200 FT, using their forward-firing guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire while delivering their bombs. Larner's orders to his pilots were direct. Find your target. Come in fast and low. Use your guns to clear the decks. Skip your bombs into the hull. Get out fast. The formation would attack in elements of 3 or 4 aircraft, with wingmen providing covering fire while lead planes concentrated on bombing. They would approach targets from the beam, parallel to the ship's length, maximizing the target profile and giving the bombs the best angle for skipping into the hull. Timing was critical. Release the bombs too early and they would bounce over the target too late, and the aircraft would be directly over the ship when the delayed fuses detonated, destroying bomber and crew. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. At 8:55 a.m., the call came. The convoy had been positively identified and was within range. Larner shouted to his squadron, Cape Ward, Hunt 0930, let's go. Engines roared to life. Modified B-25s began taxiing toward the runway at Port Moresby. Behind them, a 20 crews of the 89th prepared to follow. The plan called for all attacking aircraft to rendezvous over Cape Ward Hunt at 9:30 and strike at 10. As long as B-25 lifted off, he could see the coastline of New Guinea falling away behind him. Ahead lay open ocean, and a Japanese convoy that had no idea what was coming. The flight to the target took less than an hour. At 10:00 FT, formation flying was smooth, and the visibility was perfect. Larner could see the other elements of the strike force assembling heavy B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group climb to altitude P-38. Lightning fighters took up positions as top, cover ready to engage any Japanese fighters that might interfere. Australian bowfighters, twin-engine aircraft armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns dropped to wave-top altitude. Everything was coming together with textbook precision. At 9:55, lead B-17s spotted the convoy. 16 Japanese ships were visible on the water below their wakes, drawing white lines across the blue Pacific. 8 large transports steamed in formation, surrounded by 8 destroyers that maneuvered to provide anti-aircraft coverage. It was a formidable force, and the Japanese captains believed they were ready for any attack. At 10 a.m. precisely, the first B-7s began their bomb runs. Flying at 7:00 FT, they released 1,000 ALB bombs that fell toward the convoy in long arcs. The Japanese response was immediate and intense. Destroyers and transports opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun they possessed. The sky filled with black bursts of exploding shells. Tracers arced upward in streams of fire. One transport took a direct hit and began listing immediately. Another was struck and caught fire, but most of the high-altitude bombs missed, creating massive columns of water that drenched the ships but did no damage. The Japanese captains breathed easier. This was conventional bombing. This they could handle. Then the bow fighters arrived, 13 Royal Australian Air Force. Bow fighters came in at masthead height, skimming the waves at Over 300 mph Japanese gunners, trained to track high-altitude bombers, suddenly found themselves facing targets moving horizontally across their field of fire. Before they could adjust the bow, fighters opened fire. 20mm cannon shells ripped through. Destroyer, super ruptures. Machine gun bullets swept the decks of transport ships. The heavy cannons could penetrate armored positions. Japanese sailors and soldiers crouched behind whatever cover they could find as the Australian aircraft roared, past leaving chaos in their wake. The bow fighter attack lasted only minutes, but it achieved its purpose. The convoy's defensive formation began to break apart. Destroyers mistaking the low-flying bow fighters for torpedo bombers turned bow onto present smaller targets. This maneuver standard doctrine against torpedo attacks left the transport ships more exposed. Into this chaos came Larner and his B-25s. Larner's squadron approached from the southeast at 2,000 FT, giving the pilots time to select targets and plan their attack runs. Through his windscreen, he could see the convoy spread out below ships maneuvering wildly, smoke rising from vessels already hit by the B-17. He selected his target, a large destroyer, and pushed his control column forward. The B-25 dropped toward the ocean in a controlled dive. At 200 FT, Larner leveled out and pushed his throttles to full power. The bomber accelerated to 225 mph, the ocean surface racing past, just below his wheels. His three wingmen followed, spacing themselves to engage different targets. Larner armed his forward guns. At 1,200 YDs, Larner opened fire. 850 caliber machine guns in the nose of his B-25 erupted, sending streams of half-in bullets toward the destroyer. The effect was devastating. Japanese sailors on deck were cut down instantly. Gun positions exploded in showers of sparks as armor-piercing rounds penetrated steel. The destroyer's bridge windows shattered. Chaos erupted aboard the enemy vessel as gunners tried to return fire. While being shredded by American machine guns, Larner held his course rock steady. The reference mark on his windscreen aligned perfectly with the destroyer's waterline. At 300 YD, his co-pilot called outer ranges, 200 YD, 100 YD. At the precise moment, Larner's bombardier released two 500 lb bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs dropped away and immediately struck the water. The delayed fuses prevented them from detonating on impact. Instead, the bombs skipped, bouncing off the ocean surface like stones carried forward by their momentum. The first bomb struck. The water bounced once and slammed into the destroyer's hull at the waterline. The second bomb followed, hitting the water and skipping directly under the vessel. Larner pulled back on his control column, and the B-25 roared over the destroyer's mast with feet to spare. His gunners in the waist positions fired continuously, raking the destroyer's deck as they passed overhead. 5 seconds after the bombs hit, while Larner's B-25 was a 4-mile away, the delayed fuses detonated. Twin explosions ripped through the destroyer. The first bomb blew a massive hole in the hull at the waterline. The second bomb, exploding underneath the keel, broke the destroyer's back. The vessel began settling immediately. It's watertight. Compartments flooding faster than damage control crews could respond behind Larner. His wingmen were executing their own attacks. Lieutenant Charles Howe went after a transport ship, his nose guns clearing the deck of personnel before his bombs skipped. Into the vessel side, Captain John Henbury, leading the second element, fired continuously as he approached another transport, his tracers walking across the ship's superstructure. One of Henbury's bombs scored a direct hit amidships the transport. Shuddered from the explosion, fire erupting from its cargo holds, Lieutenant John Smallwood attacked a different transport, putting 2 bombs into its hull and dropping 2 more on another vessel's bow, all around the convoy. B-25s were executing perfect attacks. The technique that had been tested in isolated night raids at Rabaul was now working flawlessly on a massive scale. The Japanese response was hampered by the sheer speed and violence of the attack. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves engaging targets that were on top of them. Before they could aim the .50 caliber suppression fire from the B-25s, made it nearly suicidal to man exposed gun positions. Sailors who did try to fight back were cut. Down by streams of bullets, the water-skipping bombs themselves were devastating. Unlike high-altitude bombs that could be evaded by maneuvering, these weapons came in so fast and so low that evasion was impossible by the time a lookout spotted. An incoming B-25, the bomber had already released its weapons. Captains watched helplessly as bombs skipped across the water directly toward their ships, striking hulls with tremendous force before the delayed fuses sent explosives tearing through. Vital compartments following the B-25s came 12 A-20, Havoc light bombers from the 89th Attack Squadron also flying at masthead height. Major Glenn Clark led the first wave of 6 aircraft, and as they approached the convoy, Clark could see explosions and fire from the B-25 attacks. He selected a large freighter as his target and began his run at 200 FT and 240 mph. Clark fired his forward guns and released 2 bombs. The weapons skipped perfectly, striking the transport and setting it ablaze. Clark's wing clipped the ship's radio mast as he pulled up and over, but his A-20 remained flyable. He circled and could see his target, later identified as Tai Mei Maru, burning fiercely from multiple hits. Other A-20 pilots attacked with equal success. Captain Ed Chudoba bombed the same freighter Clark had hit, ensuring its destruction. Captain Dixie Dunbar and Lieutenant Jack Taylor attacked Kimbaru, the smallest ship in the convoy. Their bombs struck home, and the vessel began sinking immediately above. The low-level carnage, P-38 Lightning fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters that had arrived to protect the convoy. The air battle was fierce but brief. American pilots flying aircraft superior to the Japanese fighters in speed and firepower shot down enemy planes with methodical efficiency. 3 P-38s were lost in the engagement, but their sacrifice ensured that the bombers could continue their attacks without interference. The Japanese fighters that did break through to attack the B-25s and A-20s found the bombers' defensive firepower formidable. Waist gunners and tail gunners on the American aircraft shot back fiercely, and several Japanese fighters went down to bomber defensive fire by 10:15 a.m., just 15 minutes after the attack began. All 8 transport ships had been hit, and most were sinking or ablaze. 3 of the 8 destroyers had been badly damaged or were already going under. The water of the Bismarck Sea was filled with debris, oil slicks, and Japanese sailors. Abandoning ship above the devastation, American and Australian aircrew could barely believe what they were witnessing. The technique they had practiced for weeks had exceeded all expectations. The low-altitude attacks were not just effective, they were devastating. The convoy that had left Rabaul with such confidence was being systematically destroyed, but the battle was not over. The Japanese were nothing if not tenacious, and the remaining destroyers continued fighting even as transport ships burned around them that afternoon. Allied aircraft returned to complete the destruction. The second wave repeated the morning's devastating pattern. More B-17 bombers bombed from medium altitude, while B-25s executed precision low-altitude runs. By 3:36 p.m., 8 transport ships and 3 destroyers were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The destroyer Tokitsukaze floated helplessly through the night and finally sank at sundown on March 4th. Only 4 destroyers managed to escape: Shikinami, Asagumo Yukazi, and Uranami. Even these vessels were damaged. The human cost of the battle was staggering. Of the 900 Japanese troops who had departed Rabaul bound for Lille, only about 2,200 made it ashore. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul, but most had lost their weapons and equipment. Approximately 2,190 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, either going down with their ships or drowning in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. For the Allies, the losses were remarkably light. 13 American and Australian aircrew were killed. 10 died in combat, while 3 perished in an accident. 8 airmen were wounded. 4 aircraft were lost in combat: 1 B-17 and 3 P-38s. 1 B-25 and 1 Beaufighter crashed in accidents against 12 Japanese ships sunk and thousands of enemy troops killed. The exchange. rate was almost unbelievable. The controversy came afterward, and it haunted some of the participants for the rest of their lives. On March 4th, Allied aircraft and PT boats patrolled the waters where the convoy had been destroyed, searching for survivors. The orders were brutal and unambiguous. Strafe the lifeboats, machine gun the rafts, prevent Japanese soldiers from reaching shore where they could be rearmed and sent back into combat. The rationale was coldly logical. Every Japanese soldier who reached New Guinea would have to be killed by American or Australian infantry in brutal jungle fighting. Better to finish them in the water than to face them again on land. But the execution of the order was devastating to those who carried it out. Pilots reported sighting groups of 200 survivors on rafts and receiving orders to attack until there were no survivors. PT boats machine-gunned Japanese in the water through the night. The justification offered by American commanders pointed to Japanese atrocities and tactical necessity. During the battle, Japanese Zero fighters had strafed American airmen who had bailed out of a damaged B-17 called Double Trouble, shooting them as they drifted down in their parachutes. Allied soldiers fighting in New Guinea had witnessed Japanese troops conducting bayonet practice on prisoners, engaging in cannibalism, and refusing to surrender even when facing certain death. The brutal reality of the Pacific War made mercy seem like a luxury neither side could afford. Yet for the air crew who carried out the attacks on survivors, the mission was haunting. Some struggled with the memory for decades. They understood the military necessity. They had heard the stories of Japanese atrocities. But shooting helpless men in the water violated something fundamental in their understanding of warfare. General Douglas MacArthur called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. His assessment was accurate. The battle proved that land-based aircraft could destroy naval convoys without the support of surface ships or carriers. It demonstrated that low-altitude bombing was not a desperate gamble, but a reliable tactic that could be practiced and perfected. Most importantly, it closed the sea routes to New Guinea. After witnessing the destruction of the Lille convoy, Japanese commanders made no further attempts to reinforce their New Guinea garrisons. By ship, the isolation of Japanese forces on the island was complete, and their eventual defeat became inevitable. For Edward Larner, the architect and leader of the attacks, the victory was the high point of his military career. He had taken a technique that had been tested in isolated night raids and perfected it through relentless training, then led his men into combat with results that exceeded every expectation. His B-25 crews had scored 17 direct hits out of 37 bombs, dropped an accuracy rate that high-altitude bombing could never achieve. Kenny praised Larner and recommended him for promotion and decoration. The 90th Bombardment Squadron became legendary throughout the Pacific Theater. Sadly, Larner did not survive to see the end of the war. On April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months after his triumph at the Bismarck Sea, he was killed in a flying accident. Coming into land at Doadura Airfield, he performed his trademark maneuver diving toward the runway and pulling up sharply into a chandelle. The stunt had always been spectacular and slightly dangerous, but Larner had performed it dozens of times without incident. This time was different. His B-25 was heavily loaded with fuel, 8 passengers' baggage tools, and 2 00LB of bombs. When he pulled back on the control column at the bottom of the dive, the overloaded bomber stalled. It went into a flat spin, crashed, and exploded on the ground. There were no survivors. Larner left behind a wife and 2 daughters. Was buried at Port Moresby with full military honors. His legend secured by the 15 minutes of combat that changed naval warfare forever. Captain John Henbury, one of Larner's wingmen in the Bismarck Sea attack, took command of the 90th Squadron and led it through the rest of the war. The squadron continued using the techniques Larner had perfected, sinking dozens more Japanese ships throughout 1943 and 1944. Henbury himself rose to the rank of Major General and eventually served as president. of the Air Force Association, carrying forward the legacy of innovation and aggressive leadership that Larner had exemplified. The tactical innovations developed for the Battle of the Bismarck Sea spread throughout the Pacific theater and beyond. Other squadrons converted their B-25s into gunships, adding nose cannons and forward-firing machine guns. AA-20 and B-26 units adopted low-altitude attacks as standard procedure for anti-shipping operations. The technique even spread to the Mediterranean theater, where American bombers used it against German and Italian vessels. The British, who had experimented with similar tactics early in the war, refined their own version after learning of the American success. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was profound. Ship captains, who had once felt relatively safe when protected by destroyer escorts and fighter coverage, now understood that they were vulnerable to attacks they could not evade or defend against. Effectively, the convoy system that had sustained Japanese garrisons across the Pacific became untenable in areas where Allied, land-based aircraft could operate. Japanese planners were forced to rely increasingly on submarines and fast destroyer runs conducted at night, accepting far lower cargo capacities and much higher risk. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated Lieutenant General Kenny's strategic vision, his insistence on modifying conventional bombers for unconventional missions, his willingness to embrace unorthodox tactics, and his ability to identify and promote aggressive leaders like Larner proved decisive. Kenny's approach became a model for air power employment in the Pacific. He demonstrated that innovation and adaptation could overcome numerical and geographical disadvantages. The 5th Air Force, under his command, dominated the skies over the Southwest Pacific, providing the air superiority that made MacArthur's island-hopping campaign possible. The technical lessons were equally significant. Aircraft designers learned that medium bombers could be successfully modified for roles far beyond their original specifications. The B-25 Mitchell, designed as a conventional medium-altitude bomber, became one of the most versatile aircraft of the war after being converted into a gunship. The forward-firing armament concept influenced post-war attack. Aircraft design. The principle of combining suppressive fire with precision weapons delivery became fundamental to close air support doctrine. For the individual pilots and crew members who participated in the battle, the experience was transformative. They had trained for a mission that seemed nearly impossible. They had faced anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range. They had delivered bombs with split-second timing while flying at speeds that left no margin for error. And they had succeeded. Beyond anyone's expectations, the confidence gained from that success carried through the rest of their military service. Men who had doubted the tactics before the battle became its most fervent advocates afterward. Crews that had been skeptical about attacking warships at 200 FT became eager for more missions. The 90th Squadron developed an Esprita Corps that made it one of the most effective units in the Pacific theater. The statistical analysis of the battle reveals the dramatic effectiveness of low-altitude attacks compared to conventional high-altitude tactics. The B-7 bombers bombing from 5,000 to 7,000 AUFT achieved approximately a 3% hit rate consistent with peacetime practice, but inadequate against maneuvering targets. The B-25s and A-20, using low-altitude techniques at 200 FT, achieved hit rates exceeding 50%, with some crews scoring hits with every bomb dropped. The difference was attributable to multiple factors. Reduced distance meant less time for targets to maneuver. Horizontal trajectory required less precise timing than vertical drops. Suppressive fire degraded enemy defensive capabilities, and the psychological impact of aircraft roaring over mastheads disrupted enemy response coordination. The development of the technique required solving numerous technical challenges. Bombs had to be equipped with delayed fuses that would survive the initial impact with water without detonating. The fuse delay had to be long enough for the aircraft to escape the blast radius, but short enough that the weapon detonated against or near the target. Pilots learned through extensive practice that releasing bombs from exactly 200 ft at speeds between 200 and 250 mph produced the most consistent results. Deviations of even 20 ft in altitude or 10 mph in speed could cause bombs to sink immediately rather than skip, or to skip over the target entirely. The precision required was extraordinary, achieved through hundreds of practice runs, and the innate skill of experienced pilots who could gauge altitude and speed by instinct. The modified B-25s themselves represented a remarkable feat of field engineering. Major Paul Gunn and his maintenance crews performed modifications that North American aviation, the manufacturer, had never imagined. The structural changes required to mount additional weapons, the electrical systems needed to fire multiple machine guns simultaneously, the ammunition storage solutions for thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. All had to be improvised with limited tools and resources. That these field modifications worked reliably under combat conditions testified to the ingenuity and dedication of the ground crews. Many of the maintenance personnel worked 18-hour days, keeping the aircraft flyable. They scavenged parts from damaged planes. They fabricated brackets and mounts from scrap metal. They kept the B-25s in the air through determination and improvisation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also highlighted the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance in modern warfare. The Allied victory was possible only because codebreakers had revealed the convoy's route and destination. Reconnaissance aircraft had located and tracked the ships despite bad weather. Communication systems had coordinated attacks by multiple squadrons across vast distances. The integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and strike capabilities demonstrated the evolution of warfare into an increasingly technological and information-dependent enterprise. The Japanese convoy failed not because study in how innovation training intelligence and combined operations can overcome numerical or technological disadvantages. Edward Larner's legacy extends far beyond his short life. His willingness to embrace an unconventional tactic and his skill in training men to execute it saved countless Allied lives. Every Japanese soldier who died in the Bismarck Sea was one less enemy that American or Australian infantry would face in the jungles of New Guinea. Every ship sunk represented one less cargo of weapons and ammunition that would kill Allied soldiers. The technique Larner perfected became the standard for anti-shipping operations throughout the Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese vessels fell to low-altitude attacks over the following 2 years. The maritime supply lines that Japan needed to sustain its far-flung empire were systematically severed by aircraft flying at altitudes that conventional wisdom had deemed suicidal. In reunions held decades later, veterans of the Bismarck Sea battle spoke of the mission with a mixture of pride and wonder. Pride in their accomplishment. Wonder that they had survived. The 15 minutes of combat at masthead altitude, flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire, delivering bombs with split-second precision, had been the most intense experience of their lives. Many compared it to flying through hell itself. Yet they had emerged victorious. Their tactics validated their courage, proven their place in history secured. The principles validated at the Bismarck Sea remain relevant to contemporary military operations. Innovation can overcome conventional limitations. Realistic training prepares forces for actual combat. Integration of different capabilities achieves combined effects greater than the sum of their parts. Adaptation of existing systems meets new requirements faster than waiting for perfect solutions. Intelligence exploitation provides decisive advantages. These lessons learned in the skies over the Bismarck Sea 80 years ago continue to inform military planning and execution. The names of those who fought are fading from memory, but the principles they validated through blood and courage remain relevant. To every generation that must defend freedom, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of the most decisive engagements in the Pacific War, a Japanese convoy that should have reached its destination. safely was instead completely destroyed by innovative tactics executed with extraordinary skill. The technique that accomplished this victory was considered nearly suicidal by conventional military wisdom. Edward Larner and his men proved that conventional wisdom was inadequate. They flew at altitudes that invited destruction, dropped bombs with timing that allowed no margin for error, and achieved results that exceeded every expectation. 12 Japanese ships sank into the Bismarck Sea. Thousands of enemy soldiers died, the route to New Guinea was closed, and the course of the war shifted irrevocably toward Allied victory, all in 15 minutes of combat that demonstrated the power of courage, innovation, and determination. The forbidden tactic became the standard, the dangerous method became routine, the impossible mission became a template for countless successful attacks. Edward Larner did not live to see the final victory in the Pacific, but his contribution to that victory was immeasurable. The pilots who followed him into combat at 200 feet carried his legacy forward. The tactics he perfected sank hundreds of Japanese ships over the following 2 years. The courage he exemplified inspired thousands of aircrew who faced similar dangers. His name deserves to be remembered alongside the great innovators of military history, the leaders who changed warfare through vision and daring. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was his masterpiece, and its lessons echoed down through the decades to inspire new generations who must face new challenges with the same combination of innovation, training, courage, and determination that characterized those 15 minutes over the Pacific in March 1943, when everything changed.